Hey guys, this video we're going to look at the strengths of a floating exchange rate. So why some government central banks employ a floating exchange rate as opposed to a fixed exchange rate. So a floating exchange rate is essentially where the value of the currency is determined by the forces of supply and demand in the foreign exchange market. So in Australia's terms, this would mean that the RBA doesn't control the value of the Australian dollar. It actually allows the foreign exchange market to control the equilibrium price of the Australian dollar. So the benefits of having a floating exchange rate as opposed to a fixed exchange rate are as follows. Firstly, it avoids the problem of deciding where to fix the exchange rate. So as we know, the government has to decide where to fix the exchange rate in order to sort of temper the rate of inflation and in international competitiveness. So as we know, when the exchange rate depreciates, this means that the level of inflation will tend to rise. But when the exchange rate appreciates, this means our international competitiveness becomes worse off. So we have what we see as sort of a seesaw thing. So when inflation here goes down or isn't achieved, international competitiveness here is better off. So this is when the currency is appreciating. Inflation is, say, this is where the currency is actually depreciating, for example. Inflation is worse off. However, international competitiveness is better off. So what the government has to try to do is sort of like balance, so it wants to balance this exchange rate out so that inflation is here and international competitiveness is there. So it's sort of balanced out. So neither high inflation nor low international competitiveness are occurring. And this may be very, very difficult to decide where the exchange rate should be fixed in order for this situation to be achieved. So when we have a floating exchange rate, this means that the government or the central bank doesn't have the responsibility or the problem of deciding where to fix this exchange rate, so that this equilibrium balance between inflation and international competitiveness can be achieved. So the second one is it allows for independent monetary policy. Now, as we know, monetary policy is a very useful tool in managing aggregate demand in the economy. But where the exchange rate is fixed, it means that monetary policy is solely determined or used to determine the value of the exchange rate. So by increasing interest rates, that would tend to increase the demand for our securities and therefore appreciate the dollar. So when the monetary policy conversely is low or has an expansionary stance, by decreasing interest rates, this will make our securities less attractive to investors and therefore depreciate the Australian dollar. So although monetary policy works in that way, by increasing and decreasing the interest rates in order to manipulate aggregate demand in the economy, it does have a side effect of changing the exchange rate of our currency, or changing the value of our currency. So if the dollar was in fact floated, that means that any change to monetary policy would actually affect the value of the dollar. So what the government has to do is it has to conduct monetary policy only to fix the exchange rate, so that the supply and demand, either domestically, internationally, or from the bank itself, has fixed the exchange rate to the value that it needs. So it doesn't allow monetary policy to act independently to alter or to manage aggregate demand in an economy. And since we know that monetary policy is the primary tool for, say, low inflation and other domestic economic goals, that is a very bad side effect of having a fixed exchange rate. And so that's why having a floating exchange rate is so positive for monetary policy, because it frees monetary policy up in order to maintain our living standards through achieving these domestic economic goals. So low inflation, full employment, and strong and sustainable economic growth. So that's the second advantage of a floating exchange rate, is that it allows for independent monetary policy. The third example, or the third advantage, I should say, of a floating exchange rate is that it insulates Australia, or any other country for that matter, from terms of trade fluctuations. From terms of trade fluctuations that may lead to inflation. So as we know, terms of trade is the value or the ratio of export prices compared to a basket of import prices. And so assume, for example, that the world has actually increased its demand for Australian commodities. So commodities demand increase. And that has occurred over the past few years, where China has demanded more and more coal, iron ore, and all these natural commodities from Australia because of their strong economic growth. So assume that due to increased world demand for Australian commodity exports, this means that the world prices for export would rise. And so this has happened, that as we can see, as demand increases, demand supply, this means the price quantity, as demand increases to here, we can see that the equilibrium price would therefore increase from P1 to P2. So what this means is that our export, or our terms of trade here, improves, because our export prices are now higher relative to our import prices. And so what this suggests is that the value of the Australian dollar would therefore appreciate as well. And so because of this high demand for exports, people need to purchase more Australian dollars in order to purchase our exports. And so the value of the Australian dollar actually increases. So if we look at this in terms of our aggregate demand equation, aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus exports, we can see that because our terms of trade has appreciated, that means net exports has increased, and therefore aggregate demand overall has increased. And as a result, this may cause an upwards pressure on demand inflation. So what this suggests is that if the exchange rate is in fact floating, this would mean, as a demand for exports increase, that would also mean concurrently that our exchange rate would increase. And when our exchange rate becomes becomes higher and appreciates as a consequence of this increase in demand for our commodities, this means that our imports here, if we split this up into X and M, so our imports become cheaper, and it also means exports become less competitive. This is all due to this increased demand for our commodities, and which reflected in an increase or appreciation of the value of the dollar. And so this will automatically ease aggregate demand, and therefore ease demand pull inflation here. So this would moderate the rate of inflation overall in the economy automatically. So this is how the floating exchange rate can insulate Australia from changes to inflation due to terms of trade fluctuations. And finally, we have our fourth advantage, which I'm just going to put up here. Our fourth and final advantage of a floating exchange rate is that some proponents of a floating exchange rate suggest that a floating exchange rate would show problems in economic policy more rapidly. Because the Australian dollar is traded every day, Therefore, the value of the Australian dollar will fluctuate every day. And so, should there be large depreciations or appreciations of the dollar, that will suggest that there will be some problems in economic policy. It will show economic problems in policy as conducted by the government and the central bank immediately, and that would hold the central bank or the government, the federal government, more accountable for their actions. Although proponents of a fixed exchange rate suggest that if the government were to fix the exchange rate and that inflation would occur or our international competitiveness would decrease, that would actually hold the government more accountable. But this would just be the other side of the story. It suggests that having a floating exchange rate would show problems more rapidly and therefore lead the government to be more accountable for their actions in determining economic policy. So they're the strengths of a floating exchange rate. I'm glad you've listened to this lecture. It helps provide a full understanding of why some governments would choose to float their exchange rate.